LightCasting. Hi, sweet souls. Welcome to I'm Awake, Now What? A podcast investigating the intersectionality of spirituality, healing, and personal development. I'm your host, Krista Xiomara. Rack up some good karma by leaving a 5-star rating and write a review if you're enjoying the show and tell your friends about it. This week I sit down with author Mary Firestone to discuss her book, Trusting the Dawn, a personal account of post-traumatic growth, healing, self-love, and self-discovery. Mary shares how although our inclination is to turn away from our trauma and pain, it still finds a way out, and she gives the listening audience and her readers the courage to face the hardness of our wounds head on. She talks about staying integrated throughout the healing process and changing the internal narratives we tell ourselves about who we are when something bad happens to us. She leaves the audience with the healing tools of curiosity, compassion, self-trust, and deep self-love. Hi, Mary. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Krista. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so delighted to have you here today to talk about your work and your book and your life and all the things, Mary, today. But I do want to give you the opportunity first to introduce yourself to the listening audience in your own words of who you are and what you do.
My name is Mary Firestone. I have a background and I have my master's in clinical psychology. The last 20 years, ever since I got that degree, have been a lot about exploring all different kinds of avenues of healing for myself to recover from some childhood, a few instances of sexual abuse, and then also as a way to help other people. And then most recently, through my own experience of surviving the Montecito mudslide. I lead retreats with my sister Lucy, and we have a perfume that's essential oil based. It's all about making you feel good, not just smell good. And I've most recently written a book on post-traumatic growth, as an offering to others so that they know that they're not alone and that there can be a greater, brighter, more love-filled life to be lived on the other side of healing from trauma.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm excited to unpack all of that with you. And if anybody has not been to Montecito, they need to stop listening to this podcast and just get on a plane and go see how beautiful it is over there, because it's so beautiful in Montecito.
It is. It truly is. Again, it's like a reminder that really bad, hard things can happen anywhere to anyone. And
yeah.
What do we do with that?
Yeah, that's true. So the second question is just an interesting question I've always left in because I'm curious about everybody's origin story around spirituality and religion or nothing at all, and how they've come to know what they know and practice what they practice and anchor themselves in today. Obviously, this is a spiritually based podcast. So usually as somebody on the show is coming here with some sort of spirituality inclination of sorts. So what was that journey like for you? What did you grow up with and where are you at today in terms of your belief systems?
I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I went to the National Cathedral School for Girls. I was raised Episcopalian. And I would say that it was much more of an intellectual concept. The first time I really felt spiritual connection was I went to a camp in North Carolina called Camp Greystone for Girls. There was a lot of, we had Vespers and we did Bible readings and there was a lot of discussion around spirituality and Christianity in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So again, like intellectual, but like one summer, I don't know how to explain it, but I'm sure many of your listeners can relate. I felt it. I felt this power much bigger than myself and connection to spirit, to God. And then in my 20s, when I moved to California and I was exposed to kind of different religions, I would say I became kind of more spiritual than religious. I probably would still call myself that. I know the night of the mudslide, I felt a presence, a loving, angelic presence with me. I always have believed in God and angels and spirit, but I would say that experience really cemented that for me.
Yeah, very interesting. So, we're here today to talk about your book, Trusting the Dawn: How to Choose Freedom and Joy After Trauma. And this book, it was such a good read, and it was also filled with just like this amalgamation, at least from my perspective, of healing tools, modalities, perspective, wisdom, empathy. It was a really beautifully written book about what happened to you during the Montecito mudslide. So I think before we get into the first question about the book, maybe we can set up a framework for the listener, what the book is about and why you decided to write this book for people.
So my family and I had moved to Montecito from Los Angeles, which, as you said, it's true. It's a very beautiful place. It's kind of where the mountains meet the sea. It's one of the best public schools in the country. Oprah lives there. It's a really nice place.
Princess Meghan lives there.
That's right. We had found this ideal 1890s farmhouse, and we'd done a little bit of renovating. And my son was 4 at the time. I was pregnant with my daughter. The Thomas Fire had been raging all across Southern California. So we'd been evacuated for much of the time that we'd actually owned this house. We had returned back in January of 2018. And it was our 4th night sleeping in this house. And they said there was going to be a storm and a potential debris flow. Living on the East Coast, I didn't have any concept of what that really was. And so we weren't worried, and we were not in the evacuation zone. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I woke up for no reason that I'm sure of and saw a tidal wave, the mountain, coming at us really fast. My husband ran to the 2nd floor to get our son where his bedroom was. And by the time he was running towards Ever's bedroom, like the mud, the walls had crushed in, and I was up to my waist in toxic mud and glass and boulders and branches and parts of houses, and had to run the other way, where I ran to my bathroom. And out the window, I watched my 2-story house, part of it, get ripped off and twisted around backward, go down in a river of mud at 30 miles an hour. And I thought my husband and son were in the house. It was very, very loud. I was trapped for 5 hours in my bathroom. I thought my death was imminent. In between these waves of facing my mortality, I felt this loving, calm, peaceful, almost euphoric presence with me. I was rescued the next morning by a civilian by the name of Orion, and my daughter actually bears his name, India Orion, because without him, I'm not sure that we'd still be here. That trauma really began this next wave of like really deep healing and post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, I was really struck in the book when you talk about as the sunrise is coming up, right? Because it was around 4 o'clock, I think you said in the book, when you got out of bed, and the happenstance and synchronicity, or whatever you want to call that moment that you got out of bed. Imagine if you hadn't been out of bed. I don't know what would have happened, where you could have done that forewarning, but where you described, the dawn coming in, and obviously this book is a nod to that moment as well. I'm curious about, you went to bed as Mary Firestone, but then you woke up the next day as a different iteration of Mary Firestone that started you on this pathway of addressing this trauma. And in the book, you say that you didn't start having a relationship with this event until a little bit later. So how did you decide at some point that you needed help and healing in addressing the trauma?
I think that there's so many layers to healing from trauma, or healing in general. Right after the mudslide, there was just like the practical business of life. I had a 4-year-old to take care of. We had nowhere to live. There was nowhere to live in Montecito. So many people had been displaced. I was pregnant, so trying to dealing with insurance, and we just, lost our home and everything in it. And so I think there was part of me that was just like in dealing mode. And then with both of my pregnancies, I knew enough to know, my gosh, I need to do some kind of healing work, because I want to pass as little of my own crap to my child as possible. There was like a first initial layer of healing that I did. I did EMDR, which I really recommend to people struggling with nightmares or like recurrent fear loops. It was really effective for me, and it's been really effective for many people on kind of like interrupting the panic or fear, fight or flight loop that we can get stuck in. EMDR was incredibly helpful right off the bat. And then I did cranial sacral pretty much towards the beginning, which was very relaxing and kind of helped me get back in my body again. And then it's ongoing. So, I would have these waves of just dealing and then healing and then like, okay, I'm doing better. And then panic attacks about a year later. And I would say maybe like a year and a half later, coming on my way back from my Princeton 20th reunion, which I just aged myself. But, after seeing so many people, I think, and so many people hadn't seen me, and I was telling the story over and over and over again. And I was realizing, like, wait, like on the plane ride home, like, okay, yes, this is incredibly traumatic. We all almost lost our lives. And I've had PTSD and I'm still struggling with it. But then there's this whole other aspect of life and like beyond like this three-dimensional reality that had opened up for me because of this intense trauma that had kind of like forced me to look at things and open my heart and my mind and my soul in a different way. So I think that was when you asked like the waking, going to bed, and it was definitely an evolution and it continues to be an evolution. I think the recognition of how fragile life is, but also then how much more beautiful it makes it in the recognition of
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to, having gone through my own traumatic healing and watching my family go through stuff as well, and seeing how we all as humans try to find ways to make sense of the things that happen to us that are out of our control, that wound us. I wondered if you could say something to the listening audience about turning towards our trauma as opposed to stuffing it down, and having some compassionate curiosity about what happened to us and not allowing it to define us, but allowing it to strengthen us.
I think that's a great question. I mean, the bottom line is that the trauma will come out, or the residue from it. So I think it is always so interesting when people don't want to look at it. It's like, well, it's going to come out one way or another. So for me, I'd rather like look at it head on. And I absolutely get the fear and the exhaustion over like having to go back into something. I think though, if we do it with the right tools and the right guides, that it doesn't have to be scary, that it can be incredibly relieving. I think in particular, a lot of men can struggle with even acknowledging that things that happened to them were traumatic. Maybe just, culturally it's supposed to be tougher, that that's a trauma. I think the first step is acknowledging that what has happened to us has been traumatic. And even like there's sometimes when people are like, yeah, but mine's not as bad as hers or theirs. And there's no hierarchy of trauma. Everyone's trauma is the worst because it happened to them. Dr. Edith Eger, who I love and I interviewed for the book, she's a Holocaust.
She's so wonderful.
Isn't she the best? I just love her so much. It was such a healing conversation. She's a Holocaust survivor, and she's been a practicing therapist down in La Jolla for decades now. But she really explains that well in her two books, The Gift and the Choice, this idea that there's not a hierarchy of trauma. So I think step one is to like acknowledge that whatever happened to you was traumatic, and that's okay, and that you didn't do anything wrong and you didn't do anything to provoke it. Or I think people go through all these like blame or trying to rationalize and all this. So that would be like maybe step two. And then to find someone or a practice to begin the healing and know that it is ongoing, and it gets better. And then there's another layer and another layer. But I like what you said about, being curious and like gentle and loving with ourselves.
Yeah, that point with Dr. Edith, this idea that I think we do it so much in our society where we dismiss our own suffering because we've somehow categorized it as less or more. And it's all valid. Everything we go through is valid. And I always tell people, my friends who are like, well, I'm going through this, but it's not as bad as so and so. And it's like, well, but you're living your own life with your own individual sets of tools and makeup and DNA that allows you to embrace a situation very differently than that person. And if you guys switched your suffering, it doesn't mean that either of you would be better able to make it through that or alchemize it. I think it's such an important point to not be dismissive, and also to make sure we know there isn't a hierarchy of trauma, because I hear that a lot in conversation and I'm like, no, it's not like that.
Yeah, exactly. Grateful to you for this podcast and other people speaking about this, because I think that's the first step, is like bringing it more to the forefront, making it more a part of the conversation, and giving other people permission to share their trauma and their stories. And there's even healing in that.
Yeah, there absolutely is. In the book, in terms of the trauma as well, and the patterning that trauma creates, I think it's two things: when we don't want to address it, but also when the traumatic experience starts to get triggered in other situations, and then we have like an anxiety response, or our hypervigilance goes into overdrive. And so there's like this trying to avoid it sometimes that happens with people. And then there's other people where they get sort of paralyzed by the traumatic event if it looks like a similar pattern in the psychology of our brain. We're kind of always looking to keep ourselves safe. And so we're signaling to ourselves, if we're going to potentially encounter that trauma again, we want to steer clear of that. But you quoted some gentleman, and I did not write him in my notes, I think, but he said something to the effect of, what's in the way is the way. And I thought that was so profound. And so when we think about all of the physical responses we have to our trauma and trying to address it, how were you able to calm yourself down when you felt, the loud noises, and when there was like a storm coming again, and feeling afraid to probably be in your house alone? What was that like for you, and how did you work through all of that?
Yeah, I want to say first that I love this idea of panic attacks are terrifying and, incredibly debilitating. So I'm not saying we would ever wish any of this, but instead of like avoiding, which I understand and I have done, it's almost like noticing our body's signals, and like those are invitations and clues that, oh, like there's more to do here. So, I think that the very natural response is to make something uncomfortable go away, or to treat it, or, medicate it. Or I think that happens too much. But, and I'm not saying that there's not a time and a place for medication. There absolutely is. And I have benefited from it. But in general, when we have those physical sensations, it's like a little roadmap. It's like, hey, look, pay attention here. Something's not quite right. We need to look at this a little bit more. I kind of like to do that with myself, and I encourage other people to do it. Your body is really intelligent. It's trying to tell you something. So listen. With me, I had incredible anxiety and fear around storms and loud noises, and everything was a threat. So again, I worked through that in so many ways, a lot of which I detail in the book.
Yeah, because your fight or flight response kept getting activated, right?
It sure did. And so EMDR, again, really helpful. I have a really active meditation practice that I had before, and that even in those moments where like my brain would be fighting me, I would kind of make myself do it. Prayed a lot, and I still do. Physical exercise and like shaking and moving the body. I have a whole section on that in the book. Yoga, again, this idea of like kind of getting back into our bodies and releasing, like animals in the wild, the gazelle that's chased by the tiger, when it gets away from the tiger, it shakes and releases the cortisol from its body. And we don't do that as humans. Shaking therapy is definitely a tool.
I love to stomp outside in the grass.
Yeah, great.
That always helps me.
I stomp away, punch pillows, whatever works. There's so many layers. There's like the physical layer. And then I started to go deeper into the neural pathways and that kind of work, which I was, grew up in like 1980s, just say no to drugs, Nancy Reagan era, and was a major goody two shoes my whole life. Regarding any kind of drugs or anything like that, you can ask any of my friends. On this healing journey, I was introduced to an amazing psychiatrist, Dr. Jeff Becker, who works a lot with ketamine. I wound up doing ketamine therapy with him several times, and I have to say it changed my life. I recommend it for people that are really struggling with PTSD. They use it a lot with veterans or people with suicidal ideation or really intense depression. So I found that really helpful. So I feel like there's so many layers of addressing it and getting underneath it that continue for me.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And there are so many ways. And again, if someone picks up this book, you go into a lot of detail about all of the multiple faceted ways you're trying to address your own trauma. And a lot of that too, I think also speaks to your own internal will, right? Like there's this part of you that is trying to figure out, the why and to how to heal for yourself, which I think is really interesting and leads me into my next question about what did you find out in this journey about your own resiliency and need to stay integrated in this post-traumatic growth? Because I don't know if you felt a separation. I didn't really kind of feel that in the book, but I think sometimes when we go through traumatic events, it can feel like our parts are sort of outside of ourselves or scattered into different places, or maybe we're not as organized internally. As what was going on this journey doing for your resiliency, and how were you so invested in staying integrated through the post-traumatic growth?
First of all, there's still days where I'm like, why am I even bothering? Most days I do have this drive. I think, again, I want to keep coming back. You use the word curious at the beginning, and I feel like that is actually like my number one trait that I look for in friends and partners. And I think remaining curious is so important. It keeps us humble. It keeps our minds and our bodies engaged and on this path of evolution. So I think that is always, I don't know if I would, are we born with it? Do we cultivate it? I don't know. That's always just been this curiosity has always been a driving force for me with myself, with others, with the world. And a big thing too is I really, as much as possible, work to look at things like not to why did this happen to me, but how did this happen for me? So to kind of frame my world like that. And then wait, there was another part of your question that I'm
about the integration and post-traumatic
and how
growth.
to do that and why. Yeah.
And if you're doing it in parallel, obviously that's cool too. I think that's the point, right? We don't have to say to the audience right now that you're all the way at the end or anything like that. And I don't believe there's an end anyway. So please feel like you have enough space here to, vacillate between the ongoing healing and what's been healed.
No, thank you. And I think you're right. I don't think any of us, it's never like healed, check, done. Like
No.
There's always more to do as long as we're alive. You asked like part of what I learned and integrated and all that. And I would say one thing that happened was I had like an instance of sexual abuse when I was 7 that I have, been in therapy about for decades. And having the trauma of the mudslide and in doing my healing work, I would go in to heal the mudslide, and then it would actually be a healing for that 7-year-old little Mary too. Actually, in the ketamine therapy, I had an image of this like fierce gorilla coming out of the darkness and whisking the 7-year-old Mary away from the 70-year-old perpetrator, and realizing with the help of Dr. Becker afterwards, like that was my fierce gorilla self showing up to take care of that little girl who still needed
Yes.
healing even decades later. And I think too, that's kind of even going back to one of your other questions, like when we try to stuff things down, and I wasn't trying to stuff down that experience. I'd been working on it for years, but sometimes like another trauma helps unlock some pain that we're still carrying from an earlier one. So, great. Like, let's just heal it all. It's like a domino effect.
Yeah, I found that in my own healing journey as well. And I'm writing my second book called The Anatomy of Healing, doing regressive healing. I wrote in the book, I feel like since we don't really understand right now in the human mind totally the idea of the space-time continuum, there's part of me that wonders if we are our own angels in those moments. I've gone back to my child self and gotten her out of some sticky situations. And I think, what if I really did go back and get her? Like not only did I feel the healing in real time as an adult, but what if we are able to go back because we don't understand the space-time continuum? And I know that might be kind of a lofty idea to think about, but I feel like it could be true.
Yeah, I love that. And the more, again, curiosity and like realizing, I think for me doing like the ketamine and like reading like Dr. Joe Dispenza's work and getting to work with him, like this idea that like we are in right now, we're like in a three-dimensional reality, but there are other dimensions. Like it's been proven in like physics and, in science. So
Yeah, we just can't access them with our three-dimensional mind.
exactly, which is why like prayer and meditation and, psychedelics, if done with reverence and in the proper way, I think can help us begin to access those other dimensions, which are extremely fascinating to me now that I know have experienced them and feel them. But
Yeah.
I love too, Krista, this idea of like, you saying like, what if we are our own angels? And I love that, especially too as women. I'm like, I don't need anyone to save me. I save myself. I'm a gorilla.
Preach, girl.
Yeah, right. And then in a past life regression I was like this female knight. I'm like, damn it, I can ride away on my own freaking horse. I don't need to be saved by some prince. I am my own prince.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, that probably speaks to something deeper in the feminine collective. And I definitely feel like there is a collective, like, healing of women's own strength that needs to happen collectively for us to break, like, the chains of that patriarchal old power dynamic that we somehow do need to be saved in some way. And I don't think that's true at all. And I tend to believe we might be the stronger species potentially. I think I'm open to learning if we are or we aren't. But I think we possess a great deal of power as the feminine, and she's been really muted above, not to go off on a tangent here, but all things, considered with trauma and just our feminine journey as a collective. I think she really needs to be put back together, and we all need to go back to our, be our own angels and go back and heal all those parts of ourselves that need that healing so that we can heal the collective too.
Absolutely.
I also wanted to talk to you about changing the narrative. There's so much in your book that I ate your book up so much. It had all my favorite things in there, but there was also just like the internal dialogue with somebody's self. And I'm a big proponent of the words we choose, the thoughts we choose. And I always think about Maya Angelou and that little clip that you always hear of her saying, like, words stick to the walls and they stick to our carpet and they stick to our heart and all of these things. And so the intention and attention we should take and the care to the words that we say to ourselves is so vital. But I think in a trauma experience and in a healing journey, you definitely need to be thinking about what you're saying to yourself. And one of the things you raise in the book is pivoting from this happened to me, it changed me, and I'm better because of this. And I wondered for you two things to just talk about that in general. But for you, what was that pivot when you changed, from, for lack of a better term here, but from victim to victor?
Actually, in the first EMDR session, I think that was when the first time that the therapist had me like switch my language around, because I was telling the story as I almost died, child almost died, my husband almost died, my mom was supposed to be in the guest house, it was like that story. And just in switching a few words around to I survived the mudslide. My whole family survived the mudslide. We are physically safe, but even just switching from I almost died to I survived. That began the rewriting of my story.
The pivot, yeah.
Pivot. And I mean, language is something I've always been really interested in. We've worked with it on our retreats. We've done workshops around it, this idea of how we're speaking to ourselves. And we would never typically speak the way we talk to ourselves in our heads to other people. So becoming more conscious of our internal dialogue and also something that, I continue to work on it, but it's being like not holding myself accountable, but like, showing up for myself. If I say like, I'm going to exercise at 9:30 and like it's 9:45 or like, yeah, maybe I'm just not going to do it today or whatever. It's no, then I'm canceling on myself. So again, like treating ourselves and our schedule with ourselves the way that we would handle, like a good friend.
And we often treat other people better than we do ourselves a lot of the times.
Exactly. That has been really important to me. And I do need to, remind myself of it as well again. Yeah, I read this. He's a Harvard psychiatrist named Dr. Srini Pillai, and he has done a lot of research with self-talk. And he found that even when we talk to ourselves in the third person, it's more effective. It like bypasses part of the brain that makes the speech more effective. So instead of like, I'm gonna give a great interview right now, it's more if we say Mary, you're gonna rock it. It's like that subtle shift too, he found is more effective.
It's almost like you have your own objective observer is what I felt like when you wrote that in the book as well. That 1 degree out, I felt like would allow a lot of grace and positivity if you did turn your language to that third person perspective. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. And then maybe, Krista, it even ties back into your idea that we are our own angels, because someone else is like, well, who is the I that's watching that I? And I'm like, that's a, philosophical, maybe those are our angel eyes.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. It is important also to say, like, when we encounter these traumatic events, it is so okay for anyone who's listening to be sad and feel sorry for yourself that this thing happened. There is this moment where we get to pivot, like Mary is talking about, where we get to change what happened to us and use it for us and make it something useful and alchemaic and purposeful. I'm a practicing Buddhist, so like, we're all about suffering, right? So like, we're also understanding the suffering and what does it show us and what is it bringing to us. And I think there's so much wisdom in suffering and coming through that suffering, whatever form it takes, but also allowing yourself the grace and the space to feel sad and to not rush yourself through the upswing. Sometimes that can happen and it can be a little bypassy. I just wanted to sort of underline that piece, still allow yourself the process to get through it no matter what, as you change that narrative and language about yourself. I don't know if you want to say anything else about that too.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. It can go back and forth. It's not like a continuum. Like I've gone through, I think there's the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talks about the 7 stages of grief, and they can be fluid. We can go back and forth and we can feel great one day and positive and integrated. And then, the next day we can have a wave of sadness or anger or frustration. And I think sometimes myself too, I'm like, I don't want to be feeling this. This is like, I should be past this. And when I try to fight it, I notice it just gets bigger. So I think allowing those feelings to come and to roll through us and pass, and knowing that they will. And that again is one of the meanings of the title of the book, like trust that it does always get light again. It will get light again, so that when we're in those dark moments, to know that they will pass.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. I agree with all of that. I did want to talk about kind of this last piece of the healing journey. It felt like to me when you were going through this process too, that there was both the intellectual and academic side of you, and then also the spiritual side of you that was getting very curious about investigating what intuitively felt right for you to pull in as healing. So you talk in the book about not just healing yourself through, and you have talked a little bit about plant medicine and ketamine right now, but you also talk about other ideas of healing. And I wondered for you, were you instinctively and intuitively following a thread that you felt internally, or had you come across all of these things and just thought, I will apply this as well to my healing? How did that happen for you? I'm curious.
Yeah, everything, it was very intuitive. People would find me, or someone would suggest something, or someone would introduce me, and really it flowed like that. And even, someone was just asking me like, "Oh, well, did you do, or did you think about including ayahuasca in your healing in the book?" And it's so trendy right now. I feel like everyone's talking about ayahuasca, and so I thought about it, but it really never felt right. And then I was like, "Oh, I should really include it." And literally, I had made a decision to do it. And then I listened to a podcast. I listened to Tim Ferriss, who actually was a classmate of mine back at college. He was interviewing the guy that did Tom's Shoes. They were talking about plant medicine, and Blake had said that he had done it 2 times and he had a really powerful first experience. And then he went back and he did it again. And for weeks afterwards, he was stuck in not knowing what was real. And it was really freaky. They were both saying, I don't understand. Ayahuasca is the most intense psychedelic. So why are people, instead of going bit by bit by bit, and maybe you get your healing here and then you're good, why are people going this extreme first? If you need to get there, then it's there. So that I was like, okay, definitely not doing it. I had done the ketamine and I had an incredible experience. I had done some MDMA therapy and had a healing experience. So yes, it was all very intuitive, and very intuitive in terms of what was coming to me to try. And also, I'm just even thinking that I happened to listen to that podcast that day, what not to try.
Right.
And I think that's something I really try to impart in the book too. You are your own best guide. Something doesn't feel right, feel free to stop whatever's going on. It might not be the right thing for you, period, or just right at that time, or maybe not the right practitioner. So just really trusting yourself in your healing process. No one knows better than you.
Yeah, I think that is such a poignant point to leave that section of there, is just trusting yourself through your own healing journey and trusting that the right tools will find you. I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
So coming out of this whole experience, as we sort of get close to the end here to start wrapping up, you do talk about a sort of rebirth that happened through this process, and I'm sure we've alluded to it a couple times here. My second question was, you woke up a different person that you went to bed during that traumatic event, so you were rebirthed. Who is that Mary Firestone now? Who is that person?
It really helped me, going through all the healing work, get super clear on how I want to show up in the world, who I want to connect with. I actually wound up getting divorced. We had a really amicable divorce, and we're still great friends and co-parents. But I think, realizing how fragile life is, it made me really want to be very conscious about how I'm living it. And a big part of that is who we're spending our time with and how we're connecting with people. It's allowed me to, having the conversation we're having today, that's one thing that has really shifted. It's I don't really have a lot of time for small talk anymore. It's I just want to, really connect with people on a deeper level, and hopefully help spread more light and joy and live my life with more light and joy. So I would say those were the major shifts for me.
Yeah. To wrap it all in a bow here, I want to ask about loving yourself through this entire process, or any traumatic experience or experiences that test our own resiliency and ability to thrive. For you, how important was it to love yourself through these hard times, the good times, and everything in between there?
I think it is sort of going back to like getting back in touch with ourselves. Sometimes a traumatic event can almost, in some, I think it's in one shamanic tradition, it's almost like they see it as the spirit can get shocked out of the body. You know, this idea of like, first of all, welcoming our spirit back into our body and recognizing that we're safe again, and then yeah, loving your resilience, loving that I made it through, that you made it through, that we are, in fact, through our healing, we're more dynamic, we're more resilient, we're more able to connect with ourselves and others on a deeper level because of what we've gone through. Yeah, the loving ourselves and taking care of ourselves is a huge piece of it.
Well, we'll leave it there for now. Is there anything else that you would like to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
I feel like I keep saying it, but I think the main thing is I just want people to know that they're not alone. I think in the aftermath of trauma, we can feel so alone, but you're not alone. And I feel like if I can do it, and if the other people I interviewed in the book can do it, then so can you. So I'm here. This book is here. I want people to feel that.
Yeah. And how can everyone connect with you on social media? Where do you hang out? You can do your website blurbs here and we'll put them in the podcast show notes.
My sister and I have a website, which is firestonesisters.com. And our Instagram is Firestone Sisters. And then I have my own kind of author page, which is maryfirestone.co, not com, because someone else already has that. Trusting the Dawn 2022 on Instagram.
Beautiful. I always like to check in with my guest as well at the end here and see what 3 things they're grateful for in this moment, this week, this year, sort of anything that's in your heart center at this moment.
Well, I'm grateful for you right now, Krista, and for your bravery and curiosity. I am grateful for my children and their sweetness and their curiosity and love. And I'm grateful, for this opportunity to like talk about these things that are so important and hopefully offer some healing.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I had a wonderful time with you. I loved your book. I thought it was really well written, organized. It had so much there. And I think one thing I wanted to say is for people who may or may not be able to afford trauma, you point to a lot of other ways to receive healing in the book. And I think it's important to know that if you have financial constraints too, there's other ways to receive help, and also just to continue on to follow that instinctive inclination in you that requires healing and trust where it takes you. So it doesn't necessarily need to be in a psychotherapist's office if you can't afford that. I wanted to add that little asterisk there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's lots of different things to do for yourself at home and free offerings and
Plus all of the education from other people that you've read. I know I've read a lot of healing books as well, and Edith Eger was one of them. There's access now to so many tools for anybody out there. I think your book is a great tool as well for anyone listening.
Thank you, Krista.
This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Xiomara, in alignment with LightCasting. Music curated and created by Mr. Pixie. You can find I'm Awake Now What on all social media channels by searching IANW Podcast. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, download, rate, and review. Come back every Sunday to partake in a new and enlightening conversation. May you be filled with love and light until we meet again.